My Hero Academia Chapter 407, we learn the origins of the villain king All For One. And to be honest, it's kinda just really sad. Welcome to this Boku no Hero Academia Chapter 407 review. I'm Truth Hero, and today let's discuss the 3 biggest takeaways from this chapter. 1. All For One and Yoichi's sad origin story, from birth to true separation. 2. The fact that the famous glowing baby wasn't the first Quirk user, and how he ended up. And 3. The question: did anti-meta extremist groups lead All For One to become a villain, much like how society rejected Shigaraki and led him down that path? Does no one reach their hand out to these poor orphans? Talk about a vicious cycle, from All For One to Shigaraki. To start with All For One, we learn that his mother was a prostitute who dies shortly after giving birth to twins, him and his brother Yoichi. Before she died, she had a quote-unquote disease that caused growths on her arm, like bone rivets. She was even so drained of energy, she didn't realize she was pregnant. What's interesting about All For One is, yes, he had a horrible childhood and maybe that contributed to his villainy, but he seems to be acting on instinct to steal things. From the very beginning, he's shown inside the womb, stealing his brother's nutrients. Then, after they're born, he's aggressively biting at his mother's breast, trying to get every nutrient he can, and this is where he steals his first quirk. Remember those rivet bone growths on her arm? Well, that was her meta ability, and it's now All For One's first quirk that he's taken. This may explain why All For One is such a fan of using these rivets and spikes when he fights. Perhaps he knows deep down that this was his mother's quirk, or it's just the first one he stole and he's so familiar with it. What of course can only be described as a horrible childhood on their own. All For One kills people to survive and of course collect quirks and grow his power. He thinks that the world is created for him and him alone. He even only keeps Yoichi, his weak little brother, around because he views him as one of his things, just one of his toys. The parallels to Shigaraki and reaching one's hand out are abundantly clear here, and we'll touch on that a bit at the end of this review, but no one reached their hand out to these poor orphans. However, All For One and his brother did meet some interesting people. Anti-meta ability groups began scouring the globe to eliminate quirk users, and they find All For One and Yoichi. Unfortunately for them, All For One has enough power and uses his mother's rivet quirk to kill them all. Not that at this point All For One wants any help anyway, but yet again another opportunity for an adult or a group of adults to help children, instead of casting them out like a colony of lepers saying that they're contaminated by the meta ability. Maybe call the authorities, maybe call someone who does have a good meta ability and help these children. The anti-meta groups cropping up at this time isn't really surprising. There was a lot of chaos when quirks or meta abilities first appeared. What is more interesting, however, is the famous case, the first or one of the first recorded cases of a meta ability, the glowing baby in China, wasn't the first. In fact, it wasn't even close to being the first. Multiple people gained quirks not from birth, but after hitting puberty. Multiple babies were born in India with quirks long before the glowing baby in China. And if All For One's origin story about him and his brother is to be believed, Yoichi and All For One could be the very first set of babies ever born with quirks, with their mother being the very first person to ever manifest a quirk. What's even crazier is that All For One hates that the glowing baby is called one of the first people with a quirk. He hates that he has 10 million followers for his peacekeeping and pacifism. So what does All For One do? Well, of course, he kills him. That's right, the adorable baby in the beginning of My Hero Academia is just yet another victim of All For One. Now, I was saying before that these meta groups and society could have helped All For One while he was a kid, and maybe that's true, but it's clear now that from a youth, and maybe he's a teenager when he did this, he's evil. There's no redemption, there's no going back. He was so mad that this guy that he didn't even know, far away, was gaining a following for being peaceful, not a villain, that he said, nah, I'll take it. And what, you get a glowing quirk now? Gosh. Lastly is the relationship between All For One and his brother Yoichi, and the parallels of that to Shigaraki and All For One. What's so endearing on Yoichi's part is that even from a young age, even when he knows his brother is an evil murderer, he still believes there is good in him. He remembers All For One holding his hand as a baby. Yoichi is seen reading comics to teach himself how to read, and this is actually where All For One learns the phrase, "It's one for all and all for one." And of course he twists that phrase and believes that, well, the entire world, all for one, is for him, and that his dream now is to reign supreme as the villain king, out in the open, just like the villains do in the comics. One thing is for certain in this origin story, and as weird as this is going to sound, All For One, morals aside, actually did a pretty decent job raising Yoichi. Yes, All For One is horrible, but Yoichi grew up very innocent of the world, very protected, and while All For One may just see him as a thing, he did shield his brother from the world that rejected quirk users. And again, if society had known more about meta abilities and was advanced like in the current state of My Hero Academia, these two likely could have been saved, and Yoichi could have become a hero like in the comic books. At the end of the chapter, Yoichi can be seen running away with Kudo, the second user of One For All, after he extends his hand to him, and in the last panel, we see a severed hand. I believe that All For One is still thinking about how, ultimately, it wasn't him who reached out to Yoichi. It was Kudo, the second user of One For All. And right now, flashing back to the battle, I believe that this hand could be All For One's as Bakugo fights him, because Bakugo is constantly reminding All For One of his failure in this matter. So All For One subconsciously is reaching out his hand, but he's also physically doing it, and that's what Bakugo is destroying with his explosions. This of course is a huge parallel between Kudo reaching out to Yoichi and All For One later reaching out to Shigaraki, but it presents an interesting question. How was All For One able to reach out to Shigaraki and not Yoichi? Clearly, in order for All For One to reach out to Shigaraki, he sees him more than just an object. In fact, for most of the story of My Hero Academia, it's clear that Shigaraki is All For One's legacy. He's even right now in this battle trying to get back to Shigaraki so he can give him the original quirks before time runs out, and he rewinds due to Ares' quirk. But there have been moments where All For One thought, maybe I want to reign as the villain king once again, and he tried to take over from Shigaraki, or at least believed he wasn't ready. So it's an interesting dynamic. Does All For One view Shigaraki as a thing he can perfect like his brother, just wanting to give him power? Or does he see him more as a person with gifts of quirks and gifts of power, and to continue his villainous legacy? Now it's clear why All For One was truly able to reach out to Shigaraki. All he wanted to do was reach out to his brother. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe he reaches out to a young, recently orphaned Shigaraki because deep down, all For One ever wanted was someone to truly reach out to him. Like I said, guys, it's just a sad origin story. But what do you guys think of All For One's origin story? Could it have been different if someone had just reached out to him? And speaking of reaching out, whose severed hand is at the end of this chapter? Comment down below. If you guys like My Hero Academia content and these chapter reviews, consider enrolling at UA today by subscribing. And until next time, plus ultra.